These are all of SpongeBob's Halloween episodes, and I'm gonna rate them from best to worst. The first episode is A Cabin in the Kelp. So this episode focuses around the main girls of Bikini Bottom, Sandy, Mrs. Puff, Karen, and Pearl, and they're going on a gal pal camping trip, and that's pretty much the premise of the entire episode. Now the episode definitely has some eeriness and kind of scary moments. I mean, they are in the middle of the woods, and we see this weird reptile hand that is watching them. Also, since Pearl's new to the group, she tries bringing SpongeBob to scare the group, so she doesn't get scared instead, and he actually gets disconnected from the boat while driving, so he's all alone in the forest. But this is more of a gag, to be honest, and not really scary. They also have a scary little campfire story about Flibberty Gibbet, where they talk about how they got in a fight a long time ago at this very camp, and now she waits in the forest seeking her revenge. But it's honestly not that scary, and it's kind of a silly story, especially when the whole group starts laughing right after. The actual scariest part of the episode is when Pearl tells them that SpongeBob was messing with them in the woods, but turns out it's actually Flibberty Gibbet. And I won't lie, this creature is kind of scary, but more just disturbing and weird, just a weird green old lady. Now this scene could have been terrifying, but instead SpongeBob comes out to scare the group, and they aren't there. They're about to leave and dip out of there. So then he enters the cabin, and we see a huge green hand grab him, and we hear him screaming. Then of course they walk in, and SpongeBob and the green creature are just bonding over pine cones. And turns out it was just a sales lady. And finally Flibberty Gibbet shows up, and it's literally just a regular old dolphin, but it scares them off. And that's pretty much everything that made this episode scary. I honestly don't know how this episode classified itself as a Halloween special. Maybe because it was made in October and has some creep factor to it, but I didn't feel any Halloween spirit watching this, and it felt more like a regular episode. Also, this is a newer episode of SpongeBob, so it has that modern SpongeBob humor. So most of the episode was just kind of a gag, and they never really committed to scaring the audience. I think this is also why they didn't make the sales lady as scary, because modern SpongeBob is so keen on shoving jokes down your throat. Now while the episode definitely isn't a great Halloween special, I did kinda enjoy it. It was fun to see the girls of SpongeBob get their very own episode, especially Karen. Usually we see Karen just as a pawn to Plankton, and here we get to see her as an actual person, just being herself. And it's honestly really nice to see. It also adds to her lore, because in this episode she's very nice and sweet, and it's hard to believe that she is a partner in an evil mastermind's plans. I also think they added SpongeBob in this episode very well, without just placing him in randomly. Having him in the B-plot by himself in a forest is honestly pretty funny, and delivered a great conflict to keep it to the end. But besides all of that, the episode definitely wasn't a great Halloween special, and I wouldn't recommend watching this to get in the mood of Halloween. So even though I haven't seen any other episodes yet, I think I'm gonna put this episode in 9th place. The second episode is I Was a Teenage Gary. Now I'm not gonna lie, this is another episode that I think doesn't really deserve to be classified as a Halloween special. This episode is about SpongeBob transforming into a literal snail, because SpongeBob decided to trust Squidward with the task of taking care of Gary while him and Patrick were away at an annual jellyfish convention. Now Squidward only took this task because SpongeBob and Patrick would be gone for the weekend, and he would have a break from them. But he used this too much as a vacation and forgot all about Gary. So when SpongeBob gets back, Gary looks like he's on the brink of death, and the vet tells them they have to inject Gary with snail plasma. And Squidward misses Gary and stabs SpongeBob instead. And because of this, he starts transforming into a snail. And turns out, by the way, all Gary really needed this whole time was just some water. Now, while watching SpongeBob transform into a snail was very disturbing, it doesn't really come off as scary as I like for a Halloween episode. And the scene where SpongeBob terrorizes Squidward in the house comes off more funny and deserving than scary as well. Even the ending scene of Squidward and SpongeBob as snails is just disturbing and funny and not scary whatsoever. Now, I'm not bashing on this episode. Like I said before, I'm just judging these episodes based off Halloween vibes, and this episode definitely does not give Halloween vibes. And I really think this episode was classified as a Halloween special because it was in October and a joint episode with Scaredy Pants, which makes total sense. Now, besides the Halloween factor, this episode was great and such a classic. It was a hilarious episode, had a great conflict and a twist I don't think anyone saw coming. Seeing SpongeBob go from just enjoying Gary's food to literally morphing into a snail was hilarious, disturbing, and just such a shock to watch. Also, watching SpongeBob get revenge on Squidward was just amazing. This episode was very memorable and has been stuck in my brain for a long time, and I think that shows a lot for how great this episode was. And as a kid, I'm not gonna lie, Sponge Snail and Squid Snail are pretty scary. Like, imagine them in real life. I'd probably pee myself. But like I said, it just doesn't have much Halloween spirit to be classified as a Halloween special, but still a wonderful episode outside of that. With all that being said, I'm gonna put this episode in 8th place. Now, speaking of the jointed episode, the next episode is Scaredy Pants. Now, this episode is a masterpiece, and the episode most people think about when they hear SpongeBob and Halloween in the same sentence. The episode instantly starts off in a Halloween atmosphere with ghosts, pumpkins, and kids in costumes. And we see SpongeBob just freaking out in the kitchen. And even the Krusty Krab is Halloween themed. Already the atmosphere is amazing and so nostalgic. I feel like I'm at home. But anyways, Mr. Krabs wants to tell SpongeBob a scary story. And this is how the campfire scene should have been in the Cabin in the Kelp episode. He tells a scary story about the Flying Dutchman. And then Squidward in a Flying Dutchman costume scares him. And here's where we learn what the title Scaredy Pants means. So pretty much SpongeBob is a Scaredy Pants. And everyone in Bikini Bottom, and I mean everyone, even these random fish, enjoy messing with SpongeBob and scaring him during Halloween. So this gives SpongeBob a new goal. This Halloween, he's gonna scare everyone else and be rid of the Scaredy Pants name. So SpongeBob starts with trying to find a costume with Patrick. So he tries to become a ghost, but he's all boxy, looks like a trick-or-treat bag, and gets laughed at by his kids. This is when SpongeBob gets the genius idea to cut himself into a more round shape to be a ghost, and he obviously looks so goofy, especially these weird looking shoes. Anyways, he tries to scare a random dude, but he isn't scared at all. But this costume is giving SpongeBob confidence to not be scared anymore. Now we get to see the big finale of his plan, to scare everyone at the Halloween party at the Krusty Krab. And once again, I just gotta give kudos to the SpongeBob team for absolutely killing this atmosphere. So far, this is the only episode we covered that's putting me into the Halloween spirit. We got pumpkins, costumes, a dark, gloomy, eerie night bikini bottom, bobbing for apples. It's just perfect. So Ghost Bob is on the roof, and for a second, he's actually scaring everybody, until Patrick lowers him because of a jellyfish sting, and it ends with him getting laughed at once again. That's until the Flying Dutchman comes and scares everybody. And one thing that really stands out to me about this scene is how the Flying Dutchman is actually pretty terrifying. There have been some episodes where this guy is just a joke character and barely comes off scary at all, but here he's actually pretty scary. Anyways, the Flying Dutchman is insulted by SpongeBob's costume, so he takes it off. And SpongeBob ends up scaring the Flying Dutchman and everyone else there. Turns out when he cut himself to be more round, he cut a lot more than we thought. Bro is just a brain. Now this episode is just fantastic. It really deserves to be a Halloween special. It captured the essence of Halloween while also capturing everything that makes SpongeBob SpongeBob. It had great humor, some decently scary scenes, and a great conflict. Also, every minute there's something new happening and a new emotion you're feeling, and that's honestly amazing. Not to mention the animation style. They killed it so hard. Like I said before, this episode feels like home. It's such a nostalgic feeling. And I'm not gonna lie, SpongeBob with just a brain is pretty scary, and I know for a fact my younger self was freaking out seeing that. This episode deserves the second spot on the list. Now before you roast me, I may move it up at the end of the video, but first we have to watch every single episode. Speaking of next episodes, the next episode is The Ghost of Plankton. Now this episode starts right away with a pretty scary scene. To get into the Halloween spirit, we see a haunted mansion and a girl running away from a scary ghost, but turns out it's actually just a movie Plankton was watching, but still a great way to get into the Halloween spirit. Anyways, this gives Plankton the idea to become a ghost and try to steal the Krabby Patty formula, and that's pretty much the entire episode, but they get very creative with the process, and it's actually a very fun episode. So pretty much Plankton can't grab the formula because, well, he's a ghost, so the Flying Dutchman gives him a masterclass on how to be a better ghost, and Plankton and the Flying Dutchman go around terrorizing people and learning the steps to be a scary ghost. Now this episode isn't necessarily scary, but I think it fits the SpongeBob formula being fun and funny while still having a Halloween spirit of ghost to it. I thoroughly enjoy watching this episode, and it was nice to see an episode centered more around Plankton and the Flying Dutchman. Their friendship dynamic was actually so sweet, which is crazy for the Flying Dutchman, who's usually such a terrifying dude. And this is what I meant when I said earlier that Scaredy Pants made him look more scary, because in this episode he comes off really sweet and literally treats Plankton like his own kid. Also, this episode kind of reminds me of Monster University, and I love that movie, so I might be kind of biased rating this episode, but watching Plankton scare Squidward was such a fun scene to watch, and seeing Squidward terrified was hilarious. This episode was just such a fun episode, and while yes it wasn't scary, and while it doesn't have a very Halloween atmosphere, I think the concept of ghost and the jump scare from the Flying Dutchman at the end give off a subtle Halloween feeling, and I feel as a kid you would just be hooked. This may be biased, but I'm putting this episode in 4th place. The next episode is The Night Patty. So this episode is pretty much a sequel to the iconic Graveyard Shift episode with the hash-slinging slasher. It starts with SpongeBob and Patrick leaving Glove World, and SpongeBob wishing that the Krusty Krab stayed open later. And then Patrick tells him that the Krusty Krab actually is open late, and we get to see a side of the Krusty Krab we've never seen before. So pretty much a Krusty Krab has a bunch of terrifying fish from what seems to be rock bottom, and even have their very own female Squidward. And this place is terrifying SpongeBob. Not to mention their food is definitely not normal. And when you eat it, it makes you do some weird scary stuff, like this shake that is pretty much alive and fights back, and these onion rings that make you howl. Now already the atmosphere of this episode is pretty eerie and dark obviously, but after SpongeBob realizes no one here is actually evil and mean, he starts to have a pretty good time. After somehow breaking the fry cook's hand, which I won't lie makes no sense. This is the weakest dude in Bikini Bottom. But anyways, he ends up becoming the fry cook after getting permission from the night manager Nosferatu. And so he makes Krabby Patties for everyone, but they hate them. So he burns them and they turn into night patties. And a ghost comes out of you when you eat them, and they become a hit. Everyone loves them. The next scene though is sort of scary when a fisherman comes in to rob the Krusty Krab. And I'm not gonna lie, this dude looks pretty terrifying, but then like a second later we realize he works there and everyone loves him, and it's actually just a fun tradition they play where he steals from them, and he's actually a really sweet guy. Now anyways, they end up clocking out, and Mr. Krabs walks in confused on how SpongeBob somehow worked a night shift. And this is probably the actual scariest scene, because we find out SpongeBob was actually working in the title zone, and now he'll never know if that was a dream or not. Now this episode definitely nailed the vibes of a creepy episode, but everyone in the Krusty Krab just came off so sweet, so it's hard to really be scared. But I do think it was a cool twist, because just like SpongeBob, we were pretty creeped out at first. Then we learn with SpongeBob that everyone here is actually really sweet. This is definitely a creative episode though, and something we don't see often in SpongeBob. Nothing about this episode felt familiar, and I like learning about these new characters. Knowing that there's more to Bikini Bottom and a whole alternate universe is pretty cool, I won't lie, but as a Halloween special, I don't feel right rating it as high, because in my opinion, the Graveyard Shift killed the Halloween vibe way more, without even being a Halloween special. The Graveyard Shift was honestly terrifying, and as a kid, the hash-slinging slasher made me want to urinate all over myself. But in this episode, I was just having fun and enjoying this new world. If it wasn't for this comparison, I'd probably rate it higher, but because of this, I have to put this episode in the 6th place. The next episode is Krabby Patty Feature Creature. Not to bash on this episode early, because it's actually a pretty good episode, but the beginning of this episode is insanely cringe. So SpongeBob cooks up these 2 perfect patties, and SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs just start laughing back and forth for way too long, and they just keep getting more weird looking, and it comes off like they're trying way too hard for a laugh here. But anyways, the premise of this episode is that people want something new, because Krabby Patties are getting old. So Sandy makes this new orange floating patty, and this patty causes a literal Krabby Patty zombie apocalypse. And I can't even lie, this is so disturbing. They really went all in and making the people of Bikini Bottom look as creepy as possible while just being a Krabby Patty. And watching how they transform people is even more crazy. They literally make you eat them and then you become a Krabby Patty zombie. And the most disturbing transformation gotta be Bubble Bass. Look at this dude, bro. But things start getting crazy in Bikini Bottom, and SpongeBob ends up being the last one standing. And everyone in Bikini Bottom is infected, and there's a whole dystopian apocalypse. And it really seems like the world of Bikini Bottom is going to end, because there seems to be no way out, as SpongeBob is cornered in the chum bucket. But SpongeBob luckily finds out chum is the cure, because it's so bad, they throw up the new patty. And that's pretty much how the episode ends. This episode is pretty terrifying, and I have to give kudos to the SpongeBob team for being able to take such a creative approach on the generic zombie genre, while also just making these fish look absolutely disturbing and so scary, while just transforming into a normal Krabby Patty. Not to mention, you could never predict this episode, and it genuinely felt like SpongeBob was gonna lose. And I love endings like that. I love not being able to predict an episode. Now for a Halloween special though, I'm not sure if it really did its job. I didn't get any Halloween vibes. This episode could have easily been made in February, and I wouldn't even question it. Yes, zombies kind of give off a Halloween vibe, as people dress up as them, but I never really correlated zombies with Halloween. So while yes, this episode is very creative, interesting, fun, and disturbing, I don't see myself sitting down with a bag full of candy on Halloween night and getting into the Halloween spirit with this episode. So because of that, I'm putting this episode in 7th place. The next episode is Don't Look Now. This episode centers around a scary movie called Fisherman, and we can already pretty much tell how the episode's gonna go from the beginning. SpongeBob and Patrick are obviously babies, and for the first part of the episode, it's just them trying their absolute hardest to get through this movie without closing their eyes. Also, the movie is pretty much exactly what the title suggests. A fisherman just grabs fish and brings them to the surface. And the movie isn't really scary, at least to us as an audience, but it's really easy to see why a fish would be terrified of a fisherman, so it makes sense. But not really getting much Halloween vibes from it. But anyway, SpongeBob and Patrick keep watching the movie, trying to get through the entire thing until the theater closes, leaving SpongeBob and Patrick outside at midnight, which is the same time the fisherman supposedly comes out. So they just try to get home, and they struggle real bad getting home. And this scene is pretty dragged out because SpongeBob walks Patrick home, but doesn't want to walk home alone. So Patrick walks SpongeBob home, and so on. It is a funny scene though, and I think it fits the characters well. Anyway, Squidward ends up bringing them home and being a good old neighbor, until he decides to pull a prank on them and act as a fisherman. And this plan doesn't go too well. He definitely scares them really badly, but it flips on him really badly too. And he gets beat so bad by them, he has to go to the hospital. So this episode honestly wasn't the greatest. I do think it was pretty funny, but the episode was insanely predictable. As soon as we hear the word scary movie in the beginning, it's obvious when Patrick are just gonna freak out the entire episode, and they kind of drag this. I do think having Squidward pull a prank on them was a good spin to keep it engaging. I mean, they didn't have much to work with. The idea was pretty bland. SpongeBob and Patrick watch scary movie. Now while this episode wasn't mind-blowing for SpongeBob, it does kind of make sense for a Halloween special. While it doesn't have like heavy Halloween spirit, it's definitely a relatable experience during Halloween, especially for kids. I mean, most people watch horror movies during Halloween, and I mean, when I was a kid, I watched Insidious, and that movie had me worse than SpongeBob. But anyways, with all that being said, I'd put this episode at 5th spot on the list. The next episode is The Curse of Bikini Bottom. So this episode is kind of similar to the episode of Ghost of Plankton, except in this episode, SpongeBob and Patrick become Ghost. Now this episode is not scary whatsoever, and more of a comedy, but they got Ghost, so I guess it's a Halloween special. So pretty much though, Squidward lets SpongeBob and Patrick use his lawnmower, with the hope that they will die, but they don't end up dying, and end up driving all around the cemetery, which ends with the Flying Dutchman's beard getting shaved off. Now because of this, he curses SpongeBob and Patrick with the fate of being Ghost until his beard grows back, which is like 1,000 years. And at first, SpongeBob and Patrick are fine with being Ghost, until they realize it actually sucks, and they can't do anything they used to do, and they can't sleep well. So then they beg the Flying Dutchman to turn them back into their real selves. And he tells them he just wants to go on his date, but he's ugly now. So they give him a makeover, and it ends with SpongeBob being his beard, and I guess that helps him score. And after 2 months, they are all good and dandy and back to life. And the Flying Dutchman, after all of that, doesn't even want to be with her. And I don't understand why. She's definitely a baddie. Anyways though, this episode, while being interesting and funny, definitely did not feel like a Halloween episode. While yes, I said earlier, the Ghost of Plankton episode felt Halloweeny because of Ghost, that's more because of how he acted as a ghost. They were scaring people and acting like ghosts in actual movies on Halloween. But in this episode, SpongeBob was basically just himself, just more useless, and not scaring anybody. And even the Flying Dutchman isn't scary whatsoever. He's just an insecure softie in this episode. I don't think this episode did well grasping the Halloween spirit, and because of that, I gotta bump some episodes down and put this episode in 8th place. The next episode is Ghoul Fools. Now this episode instantly has some pretty nice Halloween music, but then cuts to a pretty normal day of cloud watching until a haunted house ship comes into Bikini Bottom, making Patrick for some reason want to go onto it. Now this instantly screams Halloween, and I'm already liking the vibes of this episode. The boat also makes Bikini Bottom dark instantly, and we get to experience Spongebob and Patrick going through an iconic haunted house, which is much more relatable and fun than watching a simple horror movie. This episode is pretty creepy too. They did really well with the haunted house and scaring SpongeBob. What's funny about this though is Patrick has no idea what is happening and thinks the entire thing is just a joke. Then we meet a new ghost, Lord Poltergeist. I really enjoy too that at least one Halloween episode decided to mix things up with the ghost aspect and not just have the Flying Dutchman like always. Now pretty much this ghost and his crew didn't mean to land in Bikini Bottom, but their head gasket went bad. So he sent SpongeBob and Patrick on a mission to find a replacement head gasket. Now the ghost crew aren't really that terrifying to be honest. After the beginning scene, these ghosts to be honest seem pretty chill, except for showing us a pizza with live anchovies. The scariness doesn't really continue though, until Mr. Krabs finds a head gasket and tries robbing the pirate's treasure. This is where he finally shows his true evil side and sends Mr. Krabs, Squidward, and Patrick into the void. And it's not necessarily visually scary, but the concept of being trapped in a black void and being tortured for all of eternity is honestly terrifying. But I won't lie, the scene where we see what's torturing Squidward is hilarious. Also, I know I was giving this episode kudos for not having the Flying Dutchman, but in the end he does end up showing up because Lord Poltergeist actually stole his treasure and was part of his crew a long time ago. This is where the Flying Dutchman becomes a literal rocket and ends up getting them all trapped in the void. Now to be honest, like before, the void is honestly more funny than anything, and they're actually just running the Krusty Krab for the people in the void and enjoying it, but still, the idea of being trapped forever tortured is just terrifying. Now this episode finally after a bit had a lot of Halloween charm. Haunted houses are one of the most iconic things about Halloween, and they did a really good job with the atmosphere of the house and making it scary. And even after delivering a simple idea of SpongeBob and Patrick going through a haunted house, they made a very interesting episode and a great conflict, with some interesting lore about the ghost of Bikini Bottom. To be honest, for the longest time, I thought the Flying Dutchman was the only ghost, so it's cool to see that there's more of them. But this episode has some great visuals and terrifying moments, while still being engaging and creative. This episode deserves the 3rd place. Now finally, the last Halloween episode of SpongeBob is The Legend of Boo-Kini Bottom. This episode is pretty similar to Scaredy Pants, and that's why I saved it for the last episode. This is really what a Halloween special should look like. The episode instantly starts off with a scary looking title card, and is actually during Halloween. We get to see Bikini Bottom, and the streets are lit up, decorated with pumpkins, and everyone's in a costume. Now one thing you may notice is the style is different. They did stop motion for this episode. Most people aren't a big fan of this style, but I honestly quite like it. It's definitely not as nostalgic and cozy as Scaredy Pants, but I think it's still pretty good. And when I rank this episode, I'm gonna judge just the episode and writing, and ignore the style. So pretty much why I say this episode is similar to Scaredy Pants is because SpongeBob is once again scared of Halloween and trying his hardest to make it all cute and fun, which is why his pineapple is decorated all cute and he has a flower costume on. Now just like Scaredy Pants 2, Squidward is the first to absolutely terrify SpongeBob, and so Patrick tries to help him by simply just telling him, "Scary equals funny," and this actually ends up backfiring on him later. Anyways, they first go to Sandy's house, and this episode really does feel like Halloween. Sandy's entrance is scary, her jars of horror sign is creepy, even she is creepy.
If you dare.
And not to mention they give a great parody on Frankenstein. And now at this point, SpongeBob is laughing at everything he usually be screaming at. The next 2 places we get to visit are Mr. Krabs' haunted house of the Chum Bucket and Plankton's haunted house of the Krusty Krab. And I just love this so much. It honestly makes you feel like you're on some Universal ride. They just absolutely killed this vibe. Then we get to see the conflict of this episode. So pretty much the Flying Dutchman loves Halloween because everyone is scared and screaming. And since SpongeBob thinks scary equals funny, he makes it his mission to scare SpongeBob because he's laughing on Halloween. After not being able to scare him normally, we get to see the ultimate haunted house, the Flying Dutchman's ship. And this sequence is a masterpiece. It literally feels like the haunted house ride at Disney, and a little hint of Nightmare Before Christmas. There's this creepy song while ghosts just swarm and dance around SpongeBob, and this scene doesn't even feel like SpongeBob. They really outdid themselves. Now SpongeBob is still laughing, and doesn't think any of this is scary at all, which makes the Flying Dutchman pull out his big guns, and capture all of his friends' souls, which finally, after all the terrifying things he's seen, makes him realize that sometimes scary does equal scary. Also, the Flying Dutchman is finally really evil. He literally tries to kill the souls of all of his friends, until SpongeBob comes saving them, and it really feels like SpongeBob is about to lose. But they pull the same thing as Scaredy Pants, where SpongeBob scares him in the end, except this time it's much more creative. So Plankton convinces the Flying Dutchman to enter SpongeBob's brain, and they change the style once again. And this place is a whole trip. The writers had to be on something making this place, but it's the Flying Dutchman's nightmare. A super cute and loving creepy place. And this place terrifies him and he flies off once again. The episode even ends with a happy Halloween sign. Usually I love the nostalgic original episodes, but I just can't not love this episode. It's one of the most creative episodes I've ever watched in SpongeBob, and they really went all in to make such a great Halloween episode. I instantly felt the vibes of Halloween, and the atmosphere was absolutely brilliant. We saw a bunch of trick-or-treaters, a bunch of fun decorations, iconic places all decorated. This episode honestly felt like a fun amusement ride, and it was so insanely fun to watch. It also had some pretty scary scenes. For once, the Flying Dutchman was actually pretty scary and evil, and not super chill and likable at all. While some people don't like the style, I just think this episode deserves the first spot because of how much work and creativity went into it. I love this episode, and I can't believe I just now finally watched it. I was really missing out. But I don't know. I'm just watching the Halloween episodes of SpongeBob and ranking them from the best to the worst. That's what I'm doing. I'm just talking about the best episodes and the worst episodes of SpongeBob Halloween. That's it. That's all I'm doing. Thank you.